everyone, I'm Ria Pauly and I'm a women's empowerment coach and a psychic, and I want to do a video for you today on one of the subjects that I'm passionate about, and that is childhood trauma and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a big topic. Lots of people are affected by it, but because it's relatively new in the psychological community, there isn't a lot of information about it out there. A lot of people don't even know that they've got it, and it can be extremely debilitating and causes a lot of issues in the adult lives of children who are subjected to trauma. Now, when I say trauma, I'm talking about physical, emotional, psychological, and sexual abuse. I'm talking about emotional neglect, which we now know causes more stress in the child and can cause greater damage to their developing brains. You may be a child that witnessed your parents being violent towards each other. You could have had a parent who had alcoholism, drug addiction, gambling, or a mental illness, because all of those things make people self-absorbed. And a self-absorbed parent is not a parent who is responding in a natural way to a child's emotional needs. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And if you are new on the channel, don't forget to like and subscribe to this video for more like it. How does a child get complex post-traumatic stress disorder? Well, they get it from living in a war zone, just like war veterans have post-traumatic stress disorder. And we now know people who experience other things, awful events in their lives over a period of time, get post-traumatic stress disorder. Imagine being a small child. The damage usually occurs at an age younger than 5. And you're a tiny little person living in a world of giants, and those giants are not caring for your needs, but you know that you can't care for yourself, and you're looking towards the adults around you to be sane and rational and be able to deal with life so that the world is not a scary place. And those adults are not watching you. They're not giving you the attention that you need because they're too busy being caught up in their own drama, and they're probably the children of trauma and dysfunctional families as well. So this is not about blaming parents. I'm a parent myself and I have 3 children, and it's impossible to do a perfect job. You can only do the best that you can. We all have stuff we've got to deal with. It's about acknowledging that such a thing exists. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder, a small child that has had to live in a world where it's scary and where no one is taking care of them. To a child, it's about survival. They can't take care of themselves, so they look to the adults to take care of them. And if the adults aren't even noticing that they're there, validating their experience, teaching them and explaining to them how to deal with their emotions, then the child isn't going to develop properly. We know that children or babies who are not hugged and loved when they're younger than 2 have a thing called failure to thrive. They actually die if they're not cuddled and loved. So our desire and our need for cuddling and physical touch and love doesn't end when we go from being a baby to a toddler to a small child. It's still there. As adults, we love to be cuddled and touched. But I wonder just how many of you grew up in families where no one touched you, no one cuddled you, no one tucked you into bed and read you stories. So childhood trauma causes brain damage. The child's brain is developing. They're fearful. Their stress response is constantly triggered. They could be in the flight-fight mode. We now know that's flight, fight, fawn, or freeze. There are actually 4 Fs, but it's our natural response to fear and fearful experience. And so the child is constantly triggered, lots of adrenaline and cortisol rushing around in their body. And it causes their brains to not develop properly. So one of the world's leading experts, Gabor Mate, a doctor from Canada, who's an expert in drug and alcohol, says that all of the people with drug and alcohol abuse are the children of trauma. They all come from dysfunctional childhoods. So this is far more widespread than any of us knew. And the thing is, all of us, and I include myself in that because I have chronic post-traumatic stress disorder and am in recovery from that. All of us who've been through those experiences have to deal with the effects of it for the whole of our lives. It's not something you get over in 5 minutes because there is that, possibly that brain damage there. So there are things that we can do. There are things that we can understand about it and about ourselves and our responses to life and our emotional life. We can become more emotionally literate, more emotionally intelligent. We can heal some of the worst events that or experiences that have happened in our lives in a variety of ways. And those ways, you know, there's many therapies that we use to work on that. So there is a lot that can be done. You've got to know that you've got it and start the journey of healing before it's going to get better. So I've been to lots and lots of psychologists and counsellors and had years and years of therapy. No one ever told me I had chronic post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is true because a lot of psychiatrists, psychologists and counsellors don't even know anything about it. I mean, it's the same as doctors. They're working in their busy practices. I know some psychologists who see 6 or 7 clients a day for an hour. They're working in their busy practices. It's hard for them to keep up with what's going on. Chronic post-traumatic stress disorder, as far as I know, is not yet in the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic manual that psychology and psychiatry uses to diagnose disorders. A lot of people that have chronic post-traumatic stress disorder have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. There are very strong similarities between them, but they're actually the children of trauma. They've always said that borderline personality disorder has an element of childhood trauma, that it's triggered by childhood trauma in some way. And, you know, it's interesting about this whole thing that it doesn't matter if you weren't beaten. I mean, let's face it, I grew up in the 50s and 60s. We were given the cane at school. Teachers hit us. Teachers hit us with rulers. They threw dusters at us. They poked us in the back. They slapped us on the legs. You know, they did all sorts of things to us. We would call that physical abuse now. We were all subjected to that. And so that was school, and then we went home, and most of us were disciplined at home in the same way. Does that mean that all baby boomers have chronic post-traumatic stress disorder? No, I don't think so. I think there's a big difference between smacking a child on the bum because they've done something obviously naughty and have put themselves or others at risk by doing it, and you need to punish them quickly and efficiently. There's a big difference between smacking a child and going into a rage and flogging a child with a leather strap, or many of the awful abuses that have happened to children. I mean, some children just have horrific childhoods. So, you know, the major theme of this is emotional neglect. If a child is sexually or psychologically or physically abused, then they're at the same time emotionally neglected, right? Because they're not allowed to express their feelings, they're not allowed to express their anger, and they have to adopt the parent's worldview. A lot of children with a lot of adults, I should say, with CPTSD may be the children of narcissists or psychopaths who have no empathy and want to raise their children like little robots, you know, obsessive compulsive, perfectionist, very strict rules in the house, very cruel punishment if those rules are not kept or if they're broken. And the child's not allowed to have their own worldview, their own voice, experience their own opinions, and that causes a lot of trauma. Now, what happens to these children is that they grow up and they have anxiety. Well, I'll go through the symptoms, and I'm going to read the symptoms to you out of a very good book that if you think that you might have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, I suggest that you get this book. It's written by Pete Walker, and it's called From Surviving to Thriving, CPTSD. And I'm just going to read, you know, his version of the symptoms here. So emotional flashbacks is the first one, which means that you get triggered by things. So and this is true of all of us. This happens to everybody. If you have trouble controlling your emotions and something happens and your response is exaggerated in comparison to the thing that's happened, then you're in an emotional flashback, you've been triggered, and unconsciously the thing that's just happened to you is unconsciously reminding you of something that's happened in your past, more often than not in your childhood, that you haven't processed and resolved properly, because as children we don't have the resources to be able to do that. So emotional flashbacks is a big one. Tyrannical inner critic. So adults with CPTSD often criticise themselves internally more than anyone could. And it's usually a parent's voice that they hear inside their head. It could be their mother's or their father's voice. They were criticised a lot when they were younger, and so that stays with them. So if you've been brought up by a narcissist, everything is your fault. You are always to blame. You are naughty. You are wrong. You are bad. No one ever apologises to you. The parent's never wrong. And so you can adopt this lifelong habit of blaming yourself for everything that goes wrong. So that gets us to toxic shame, because children of trauma have a lot of shame. It's embarrassing. Everybody, even back when I was a child, when we only had television, we didn't have social media, it was pretty obvious to all of us the children that were loved and cared for and adored by their parents and emotionally nurtured in comparison to the children who weren't. You know, I remember one girl that was at primary school with me, and she was quite a feisty, Joan was her name, she was quite a feisty, you could see that underneath it all she had strong will, but it was all repressed and buried and held back, because she would come to school with huge big red welts up and down her legs, having been flogged by her father quite regularly. And, you know, it was sad. It was terribly sad. And imagine the shame that she had, having to come to school with those red welts all over her legs and everybody knowing. You know, lots of children who are physically neglected, their clothes aren't washed, they don't have the right school books, they don't have the right uniform, they come to school with no breakfast. I mean, this still happens today. It hasn't stopped. That used to happen all the time. And so you get, children are always comparing themselves with other children. They're always looking outside themselves to see, you know, what they're supposed to be doing. That's how we learn, right? And it's easy for children to see that that there's something missing in their lives, so they feel that shame. But the parents often use guilt and shame on them. These kind of parents who have themselves suffered from childhood trauma use guilt and shame on the child and manipulate them in order to discipline them and keep them in line, or they're narcissists and psychopaths, maybe just for the hell of it. Adults that have gone through childhood trauma often have self-abandonment. So they abandon themselves. They set goals and then give up on them. They put everybody else before themselves. They make everybody else's wants, needs and feelings much more important than their own. They often have very shaky boundaries, and they don't know how to say no, and they don't know how to stand their ground because they weren't allowed to as a child, often. So they abandon themselves very quickly. There's nobody in their corner. They can't stand up for themselves because they weren't allowed to. So they continue to carry on that behaviour or that response throughout their whole lives. They often have social anxiety. It's really common, or just generalised anxiety disorder, and be very anxious because to them the world's not safe and there's always something to be frightened of. You know, if you're a child growing up in a home with a rageful parent that has a mental illness or an addiction, and you never know when you're going to cop it next, you never know what you're going to get into trouble for, you're always waiting for the other shoe to drop, you're walking on eggshells, you develop anxiety and hypervigilance. You know, I've got to notice everything that's going on because I'm not safe and what's going to happen next. You know, is mum and dad okay? Are they all right? Otherwise, I'm not all right. So yeah, it goes in and it, you know, programs the child's mind. They often have abject feelings of loneliness and abandonment because they were emotionally abandoned. They could have been physically abandoned. I mean, you know, there are horrible cases of children, and you know, I've worked with a lot of people who have sexual abuse in their background, and they were sexually abused. They told a parent, and the parent wouldn't believe them, and so you know, they had to carry the shame of apparently telling stories about somebody. Their parents weren't on their side. They didn't believe them. Then they had to deal with all the feelings of being sexually abused. I mean, you know, this is a common story, unfortunately. So there's a really deep feeling of loneliness in people who have had childhood trauma because the version of love that they had as a child was flawed and incomplete. So they weren't loved in the way that they should have been. Their emotions were not nurtured. They didn't have compassion and kindness and caring that we know that children need. And so they forever feel lonely, as if there's a big hole inside of them that can't be filled up. They often have fragile self-esteem. They have attachment disorder. So they might have anxious attachment. When they get into relationships, they're frightened of the other person leaving them and abandoning them, and they may become very needy, or they could do exactly the opposite. They could get into relationships and then run away because they're terrified of being attached. So those things are common. Developmental arrests. In other words, part of them can be stuck in childhood. They may be very mature in one area of their life. Say it's work, for instance, and they go off to work and they are very capable and intelligent and do a wonderful job. But in relationships, they might be very childlike. A key feature is relationship difficulties, and it's often very difficult for children of adults that have childhood trauma to have relationships, because if you can't trust your parents to love you, who can you trust to love you? So there's a real trust, there's a fear of a trust issue, there's a fear of abandonment. There is often very poor modelling of what a loving relationship looks like. So they have no idea how real people behave when they love each other, what's acceptable, what is not acceptable. You've grown up in a family that is dysfunctional and toxic, and your parents are always drunk and fighting and hitting each other and screaming at each other and criticising each other. Maybe that's what you think love is. So often have a great deal of trouble with relationships. Trauma bonding is another huge one. So if they've had a parent that was abusive, it's a bit like having Stockholm syndrome, right? People who are kidnapped and held hostage often develop feelings for the person who kidnapped them, and they call that Stockholm syndrome, and it's a survival thing. If you can identify or connect with the person who is holding you hostage, your jailer, then it makes your life easier. And in the same way, children can absolutely adore and idolise the most abusive parent that they had, and constantly be searching for the love of that parent. If I can just get that parent to love me, then I will be okay. And why does the child need to get the parent to love them? Because they can't look after themselves. and they need their parents' attention, and if they're not getting their parents' attention and they're not seen, then they could die if no one's watching them. I mean, it's a primal desire of the child, and that's why you'll see children saying, look at me, look at me, look at me, mummy, look at me, look at me, because it's very important for them to get their parents' attention. So children of abusive parents can develop trauma bonding. To them, love is trauma. And so they grow up and they unconsciously gravitate to members of the opposite sex, or loving partners, I should say, who traumatize them because they think that's normal. That's what happens in relationships. They're nice to me one day and they're horrible and mean to me the next, because that's what happened to them as children. And their intellectual mind might know that it's not right and that they're being treated badly, but their emotional self, that inner child that is still trapped at the age that they were most traumatized, maybe that's 4 or 5, can't emotionally disconnect from that trauma bonding. So it causes a lot of trouble being there. Radical mood swings. And so those radical mood swings are described in borderline personality disorder. That's why the two are often very confused, because, you know, mood dysregulation is what borderline personality disordered individuals have. But it's also very common in complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Dissociation via distracting activities or mental processes. So because the child was put in fight, flight, fawn or freeze mode quite often as a child, they'll have 2 of those things that they gravitate to more. So when there's strife or terror around them, they may freeze. I'll just shrink myself down really, really tiny and I won't make any noise, and I'll creep off to my bedroom and nobody will notice, right? Or they may fawn. What can I do for you, Mummy? Can I help you? Would you like a cup of tea? Can I pat you on the back? So the child begins to look after the parent that's having the problem. And children of dysfunctional families are often parenticized. Usually, you know, they're often made to take responsibility for the parents' feelings, to repress their own feelings, because the parents' feelings are always louder and more intense, and so they know that, you know, it's not all right for them to feel anything or to get angry. They have to repress that or suppress it because, you know, the parent isn't okay, that's supposed to be taking care of them. And having gone through lots of trauma, a lot of people dissociate. So we have times, this happens to me, we have times where we just go blank and we can't think of what to say or what to do. It's like you just dissociate from the moment. And it might only last a few seconds, or it might last a few minutes, or it might last a lot longer. But it's a very significant difficulty in coping with life. Have you ever had that experience where somebody comes up and they're, you know, verbally attacking you, and even though you might be really, really articulate and good with your words and, you know, good at sticking up for yourself, you go blank and you can't think of what to say. And then you go away and you think, oh my God, I should have said this and this and this and this, and that can, you know, you get obsessed about it, it keeps playing on your mind. It's because you disassociate in that moment. You're in terror. The inner child in you goes into terror and disassociates, because that person attacking you represents, you know, huge big mum standing over you with a leather belt about to kill you for something you don't even know what you did and attacking you. So it's, you know, it's that kind of thing. Hair-triggered flight or fight responses, we talked about that. Oversensitivity to stressful situations, right? So you, just like people with PTSD, you've been through so many stressful situations as a child that you can't cope with them very well. Some of us, this is me, I go into, you know, in a stressful situation, I become very calm and I go into hyperdrive and I know exactly what to do, because you know, I'm an empath and I'm a rescuer and a fixer. That's how I coped. So I do that, but then I crash later. After it's all over, I might go and have a cry, or have a crash, I have to crawl into bed and pull the covers over my head. And lots of people that have had childhood trauma are suicidal. Many of them kill themselves. So it's very complex. The first step in getting over it is knowing all about it. I think for most people that have these symptoms, and if you identify with having these symptoms, the best thing you can do for yourself is to find out as much about it as you can, because knowledge is understanding, and then you will identify with what has happened. And so that's why Pete Walker's book is really good, because he tells the whole story and then he tells you how to heal yourself and what you need to do to get out of it. But the first step is acknowledging it. So some people come to see me as a coach and they say, oh no, I had a happy childhood, my childhood was great. And they're in denial about what happened. And then when you start to pull their story out, and it's like, oh yeah, you know, mum was an alcoholic and I had to get myself off to school and I had to take care of my little sister, and you know, mum would go to bed for days and not come out, and you know, then she got sick, and you know, you hear the story and it's not the happy childhood that they tell you about. I mean, I think that's a survival strategy too. We all want to believe that we had a happy childhood, and just not the case. Life is difficult for a lot of people, and if we have it passed down from one generation to the other, you know, childhood trauma going from grandmother to mother to daughter to, and on it goes. And it's got to stop somewhere. It really has to stop somewhere. We have to get smarter about this. We have to understand what it's all about, what causes it. And of course, the antidote to all this, if you're parents out there, the antidote to all this is not to overparent, not to be helicopter parents. There are times when you need to say no to your children. You know, having really, really good boundaries, something that a lot of people with CPTSD do not have, by the way. Having really healthy boundaries is important, very vital in all relationships. So, you know, you can overparent and ruin your kids. What we know about parenting is this, that the best parenting is what they call good enough parenting. It's not overparenting and it's not underparenting. And what parent hasn't blown up at their kids? What parent hasn't got angry and yelled at their kids and screamed at them and told them to go to their rooms? I mean, anybody who's had children will know that this happens. But it's very different to do that. And then when you calm down, you go and apologise to the child and give the child a cuddle, say, look, I'm sorry, you know, Mummy's going through something right now and I shouldn't have yelled at you. That was really bad. I'm really sorry. Right? That fixes it and heals it. But if you don't apologise to the child, you just continually keep adding pain on pain on pain, then that's what causes the problem, right? You know, it's that old thing that they say psychologically it takes 5 nice things to make up for one mean, horrible thing that you've said to someone in relationship. So if you've done a mean thing to your child, you've got to do 5 nice things to make up for it. And those 5 nice things might be a cuddle. You might be telling them that you love them, telling them that they're wonderful and things that you like about them, reading them a story, cooking them their favourite meal. It doesn't have to be anything huge, right? It doesn't have to involve money and masses of fancy outings and electronic equipment. We're talking about everyday love. So don't feel guilty if you've got children and you've yelled at them. That's my advice. Don't feel guilty, because we've all done that. But if you think this is you, get Pete Walker's book and have a look. I do coaching for people that have had childhood trauma and have complex post-traumatic stress disorder. As I said, I'm a survivor of it myself. So I fully understand all about it, how it feels and the complexities. And it's my passion to help women. I only work with women. It's my passion to help women who have been through these sort of difficult circumstances. And, you know, you might have had a dysfunctional childhood and then you've gone on and you've had 3 or 4 relationships with abusive men. That's how it works. So if you're wondering why that pattern exists and why you seem to keep getting yourself into a relationship with the same guy, this is the answer. the answer. Okay, if you've enjoyed my video, please give me a thumbs up. It'll really help me, and leave me a comment. I'd love to hear from you.